thank you everybody for this afternoon. I know people are busy. We've got some people who I say this afternoon. It's this afternoon in the UK. It's this evening in Europe, or should I say in the Middle East, and it's this morning in across in America. So we've actually managed to get quite a good spread. Didn't see anybody from Australia, so that'd be interesting if there was. But thanks for taking the time this afternoon. The whole purpose of this afternoon is really just to outline and hopefully give some advice and guidance following on from the spate of protests that have really happened and increased certainly over the last 3 to 4 months. What I hope to show is that protests at cultural venues are nothing new, but it's certainly something that has taken off in recent times. And hopefully what we're going to demonstrate is there are sensible steps that can be taken, but also explain a bit how protests can and do sometimes happen. Okay, so as I say, good afternoon everybody. This is a presentation based on observations, research, but also looking and working with museums and other cultural venues in understanding the threat that has always existed, or certainly in recent times, and when I say recent times, the last 30 or 40 years, in cultural venues. As I mentioned earlier, those who weren't on the call at the start, there has been a spike and it's caused a lot of concern. And so what I want to do is outline thoughts that hopefully, and for me the aim is really, it's quite simple. I want to help people understand the risk that's posed by protester threats, help try and contextualize the issue. So, the media is a wonderful tool for getting messages out there, whether that be for positive or negative. So what I want to try and do is to calm things down slightly and to put things into context. And then what I want to do is just try and offer some sensible actions that can help reduce them. And I'm going to say right from the start, I don't have all the answers. I openly admit I don't have the answers, but I do know and I do work within the cultural sector. And with doing that, I understand the concerns that exist, but I also understand the practicalities. More traditional security experts might say, let's put the barriers up, let's do this. It doesn't work. Or it doesn't work all the time. It can do, but it doesn't work all the time. So I want to, as I say, put it into context and then offer some advice, some observations, and I'm more than happy for us to actually look and discuss later on about what other people's experiences are and whether or not things that are mentioned are sensible or wouldn't work. And just to give a quick example, we have to consider different cultural aspects of museum and cultural sector. The cultural aspects of how to protect a museum in America might differ from UK and Europe, might differ from the Middle East, and might differ from the Far East. So it's understanding that that there isn't one shoe or one size fits all when it comes to this. So this afternoon's broken into 4 areas. I want to look at historical context of protests within the cultural sector. I then want to look at cultural protest trends and the speed in which they are rapidly changing. I want to, I suppose, edge it a bit by trying to offer a methodology of how a protest can take place and how a protest may take place, and show a process-driven approach as opposed to something that's spontaneous. Because certainly what we'll see throughout the presentation and throughout the different examples is there's very little spontaneity, apart from maybe one example that I will discuss. Then we'll talk about some proactive protection considerations, and I do use the word considerations because what is right for one might not be right for another, and what works in one area certainly might not work in another area. And then I'd like to follow it by a Q&A session. Okay, so if we start and look at historical context. So the whole purpose of looking at the historical context is really to understand that protests are nothing new in museums and museum settings. If we look at the painting of Venus, so in 1914, just over 100 years ago, Mary Richardson was a suffragette, and this painting was hung, and I believe is still hung, in the National Gallery. She entered with a meat cleaver and slashed the painting. She was an art student and a journalist, and her justification for attacking the painting was the fact that she was aware that men were gawping at this picture of beauty all day, and she was really upset at the fact that the British suffragette leader, Emily Pankhurst, had been jailed. And this was her protest because she described this as a piece of beautiful art, whereas Emily Pankhurst was a beautiful person, and that's where the assimilation was. As a result of this attack, the museum was closed for 2 weeks, whilst restorative work took place on the painting. These are the words that she said. So jumping forward over 50 years, we come to 1970. Bloodbath anti-war protests at MoMA in the USA. Art Workers Coalition had 13 demands, and that was because of the perceived support of MoMA during the Vietnam War. Jump forward slightly, and my apologies if I mispronounce this. Geniza in 1974 was attacked. It was a Pablo Picasso, as you may be able to recognise from the illustration. Again, it was an anti-war protest. Shafrazi was a member of the Art Workers Coalition, and he decided to attack this because Richard Nixon had pardoned the only person who went on trial for the My Lai massacre, and he wrote "Kill Lies All" in red paint. Thankfully, they were able to clean that quite quickly. He said that he wanted to tell the truth, and at that time he was charged with a misdemeanor, a minor offence. Coming forward to my working era, Imperial War Museum. Greenham Common Women's Group were protesting, and this was because nuclear weapons, nuclear cruise missiles or cruise nuclear missiles were being taken to Greenham Common, and the direct association of the Imperial War Museum with the military, with the weaponry, caused them to protest there. The Whitney Museum of American Art 2019. This was demands for the removal of the CEO of Safariland, which was a munitions company, but also the CEO was the vice chair of the board of directors, and so the protest was there demanding that he be removed because of tear gas, munitions, etc. that were being used on the Mexican border and in other places. Warsaw National Museum, there was some 3 pieces of art by feminist artists were showing or depicting bananas being eaten suggestively. The government spoke with the senior management team and demanded their removal. Of course, this was denied. However, they were removed, and the people took to the streets, showing bananas and eating them. as a sign of protest. And again, it was directly linked to the activities of the museum, in the sense that they removed the arts. Colton, those of us in the UK are very aware of this. So although not a museum or a venue, it is an historical symbol, and it symbolised colonialisation, slave trade, and the people, certainly during the groundswell of Black Lives Matter, decided to topple this and cause damage. And the last one that I would like to show you at this point is Greenpeace. It goes back from 2020 to 2016. At the British Museum, BP was sponsoring the Sunken Cities exhibition, and they scaled, abseiled up, climbed up, demonstrated, they put some banners up. They closed the museum for about 4 hours, and the reason it was closed was for visitor safety reasons. So there's a series of historical protests, and if we look at the cause of them, in some way, shape or form, they can be directly linked to the activities of the museum, of individuals within the museum, or actions that were associated with the museums. So that is, when we talk about the targeting, there's a reason for that. What people may or may not, rightly or wrongly, think is the present day and the present protests, there isn't that tie-in with them historical protests that took place. But the reality is that actually, even historically, there have been protests that haven't been directly linked to the museum or anybody associated with the museum. Mona Lisa. I'm not going to talk about the earlier thefts. I'm not going to talk about the 1956 episodes that happened, but let's look at 1974. The exhibition was taking place in Tokyo, and there was some dispute because it was alleged discriminating against people with disabilities and their access, so it was sprayed with red paint. 2009, and I said at the start about spontaneity, and that it doesn't normally occur. This may very well have been, but in 2009, Russian female decided to throw a mug at the Mona Lisa, and that's because she'd been denied French citizenship. So they aren't directly associated with Mona Lisa or with the museum. It's a more general association. And just as another example, in the 1980s, in Spain, there was mass poisoning. Tens of thousands of people were affected by tainted cooking vegetable oil that should never have been resold, but it was. Over 300 died. 40 years after this protest took place, nothing whatsoever to associate it with El Prado, but the profile and visibility of El Prado meant that it was there. They threatened to hunger strike, commit suicide, everything like that. As it happened, they made the protest and they were removed from the premises. But again, that shows, even historically, we have cases where there isn't that direct correlation with the cause of the protest and the venue itself. So that's just given a quick screenshot, dare I say, of the historical aspect. But what about our current protester trends? And what we can say is that over the past 4 or 5 months now, there has been an explosion. And when I say explosion, that's when we look at it from the volume and frequency of previous protests that took place. So there's been this explosion of protests against museum. A very significant proportion have been in the UK, but they are spreading across Europe. They are now spreading globally, and most of them are driven by the Just Stop Oil organisation. So I think it's important for us to look and say, well, who are Just Stop Oil? What do they stand for? And these are their words, not mine. It's a coalition of groups working together to ensure that the government commits to ending all new licenses and consents for the exploration, development and production of fossil fuels in the UK. And so, of course, I look at that, I scratch my head and say, what on earth does that have to do with museums, galleries and everything? I still scratch my head and say, what on earth does it have to do with them? But then we look at their specific demand. And their demand is that the UK government makes a statement that will immediately halt all future licenses and consents for the exploration, development and production of fossil fuels in the UK. So let's be realistic. A UK government will, yes, the demands are there, but that demand is never likely to materialise, but it will cause, it's driven their causes to target different venues. Now, when Just Stop Oil was formed, and it was only formed in February this year, when it was formed, it came to the prominence through road closures, targeting of oil refineries, and then other protests that were linked with Extinction Rebellion. There is an association with Extinction Rebellion, but actually this appears more, there are some in Extinction Rebellion who want to legitimise their cause, whereas Just Stop Oil is certainly one of those where it looks at the civil disobedience taking place. Its demands and the reason for it being are UK based, which is strange because what appears to have happened is because of their success in protests, people have jumped on the wagon and they are happy to associate themselves with Just Stop Oil. Globally, these are different organisations who are stated as being associated with Just Stop Oil. So we do have them in Europe, we have them in Australia, we have them in the USA. Okay. So people are seeing the protests that have been carried out, they've seen the successes that Just Stop Oil have carried out, and that movement and that activity is growing. Now, there's nothing to say that all of these groups are going to target museums, but unfortunately, certainly over recent weeks, what we have seen is not only has that targeting happened, but actually the type of attack and boldness of the attacks has increased, which is slightly worrying. So what I'd like to do is just show you a compilation that we've put together of different attacks. I'm sure everybody's seen them, but you know, I say it's something we've brought together which I think really demonstrates the nature and difference of attacks that are taking place.
No way! We just
I would encourage everyone, especially if you have children, please. I'm Susan. Yep, that's right.
Said, out of all the sciences, art is the queen of communication. And now, more than ever in this day and age, communication of the truth and of the experience of humanity during these times of catastrophic climate change is needed now more than ever. The truth is that any new oil expansion is a death sentence for the future. It's a death sentence.
Because of the climate crisis.
Security.
What is worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food? Worth more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people? The cost of living crisis is part of the cost of oil crisis. Fuel is unaffordable to millions of cold, hungry families. They can't even afford to heat a tin of soup.
Menschen hungern, Menschen frieren, Menschen sterben. Wir sind in einer Klimakatastrophe.
Time for words. This is time for action. Ladies and gentlemen. In the words of the king, the science is clear. The demands are simple. Just stop oil. It's a piece of cake.
Wat is die dan nou aan het doen? Hey! Ja, wat is er? Wat is die nou aan het doen? Wow.
How do you feel?
No, stupid.
How do you feel when you see something beautiful and priceless being apparently destroyed before your eyes?
So that was a series of clips. It wasn't all of the clips of attacks that have occurred at museums since June this year. As you can see, there's an awful lot, and you know, when you look at the methodology, you look at how it's attacked, how they've carried out the attacks, or the protest, should I say, you know, things have changed. You know, when we look at some of the earlier ones, gluing of their hands to the frames, to more later ones where they're gluing their hands to the walls, or even, you know, at the motor show where they're gluing their hands to actually the vehicles themselves. So when we look at, that's just a snapshot of the protest that took place by Just Stop Oil, as I say, from June this year. In October, in London, they decided to go one step further. And they actually had a calendar of attacks that were carried out. Many of them were related to prevention of vehicles, traffic flow, but many of them were actually directed at iconic buildings, you know, whether it be retail, you know, so you had Harrods there. The MI5 building got squirted as well. We know that New Scotland Yard did. And so actually what they did was quite a robust media campaign during that month that was targeted. So really, really interesting. What I'd like to do is just go through a few of the actual attacks themselves. And there's people who are on the call who I know have far greater knowledge than I on these. So, what I want to do is give the top level discussion and outline of it. So if we look at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery, and this happened 29th of June, and this was in Scotland, in Glasgow. 2 female protesters, they glued their hands. In total, 5 people were arrested, and they put their hands on the frame. They glued their hand to a frame. Now people might say, so what? But actually, when we look at art and we consider all the potential consequences that, the damage to the frame, which is part of the original painting, we look at it having to be removed. We look at the damages caused to the walls. We look at the disruption that's caused. And one of the things that people really do not think about or consider is actually the distress that is caused to staff. I spoke with people who were there, and the one thing that really came out and shone through was how much it impacted people who would probably have never in their life experienced this type of violence. And that's the word that was used. This type of violence in their life. Museums, galleries are not the sort of place that was used to this type of incident taking place. Now, one of the 2 here, Hannah Bright, 20-year-old, she was actually a student at Glasgow School of Art. Now, her words were, this landscape was painted in 1860 at the height of the Highland clearances, and this relates to where whole crofting communities were evicted by new landlords who ruthlessly pursued their own private interests and, for their financial gain. She associated what happened then with what's happened today with the oil and gas companies. Her words were, today, the oil and gas companies who are ruthlessly pursuing their own private interest at the expense of literally everybody. They are endangering everybody. We must learn from history of Scottish crofters on how to fight back effectively. Now, they're actually quite powerful words. There's many of the aspects of Just Stop Oil that I totally agree with. Their methodology when it comes to cultural sector and the cultural community is probably one where I am at 180 degrees disagreements with, because their understanding of damage that is being caused, the distress that's caused, to a degree is quite narrow. And as we go through, we'll see some other comments that actually say that. So the Court Hall Gallery, the day after, so this was peach trees in blossom, and it showed the French countryside. One of the protesters here quite said, Louise McKenchie, I believe her name is, said, as a kid, I used to visit this painting. My dad took me to see it. I love this painting, but I love my family and friends more. I love nature more. I value the future survival of my generation more highly than my public reputation. It is immoral for cultural institutions to stand by and watch while our society descends into chaos. Galleries should close. Directors of art institutions should be calling on the government to stop all new oil and gas projects immediately. We are either in resistance or we are complicit. So them words to me are markedly different to something that was said the day before, because it's openly using the word resistance. Resistance to what? We have artwork there that's a few hundred years. Yes, the planet, we want to protect the planet, but by damaging or potentially damaging artwork, is that a justifiable cause? They believe so. The sunflowers, and again, words off one of them, and you heard them there. What use is art when we face the collapse of civil society? And Just Stop Oil posted on Twitter, and it was around the time of the action that was carried out. The art establishment, artists, and the art-loving public need to step up in civil resistance. if they want to live in a world where humans are around to appreciate art. So again, we look at the words that are being used, and it's a lot more resilient, a lot more, dare I say, a lot more robust in its messaging. And it's basically saying to the art community, stop, or we're going to continue. And of course, we had the one where we looked at the girl with the pearl earring. And again, this is just a little more than a week ago. How do you feel when you see something beautiful, a priceless thing, apparently destroyed before your eyes? Do you feel outraged? Where is that feeling when you see the planet being destroyed? Now, there have been numerous other examples around the world where art has been attacked. But what I say is, what has to remember is that to the general person, it might seem that these are just randomly chosen. But when you actually look at things in a bit more detail, I don't believe that's the case. I believe these are targeted. A great deal of effort has been taken in their execution, and we'll talk about as we go forward. But that is just, again, a brief snapshot of the sort of attacks that are now taking place, and that those within the cultural sector may face. And I do use the word may face. I mentioned about attack methodology. This is not science, and these are my thoughts. But how do protests happen? From a risk management perspective, if you understand how something is going to happen, then the greater the opportunity exists for you to take proactive steps to prevent or minimise the impact of it happening. We can't be prescriptive about the process. We can't be descriptive about this is how a protest will take place. But if we look at and analyse the protests that have happened, I think it's fair to say that what I'm going to show is the process, the methodology that is or has been adopted, and that is the attack cycle. And the attack cycle is a process that we can use for organised crime groups, criminals, and terrorists, which demonstrates how an attack process takes place. Again, I'm not saying this is categorical, but it might help you understand the sort of thought process that takes place by people who are undertaking protests or any other criminal activity themselves. So the attack cycle will normally start with the target selection. Okay, there we go. There's the target being selected. So, and what we'll go through, I'll go through everything, and then I'll break down a bit more. So after the target selection, they'll plan how the attack's going to take place, and then there'll be the act itself, the attack itself. Target selection, planning, protest. It fits nicely. Escape may or may not be the case, and as we've seen, because of it being a protest where they want the world to see, they aren't afraid of being arrested. As a matter of fact, it's part of their cause. It's part of their exploitation. So escape, to a degree, may or may not feature in the protest cycle, if we want to refer to it as that. When we look at the escape process, if they're gluing their hands to the walls or anything, they ain't going anywhere quickly. So, I'll say another reason why I might think that escape might not really feature, and this methodology might not actually be adopted. But if we look at the process, it seems to be that's what's happening. So let's look at target selection. Targets selected for several reasons. It could be ideology, it could be the value, it could be the profile of the venue. And here we are looking at cultural settings. It could be for a distinct hatred for someone, something, an object. It could be that individuals are actually acting on instructions. And that could be from senior management, if we want to refer to them as that, of protest groups. But it doesn't appear to be that's the case. It appears to be pretty much free rein. With a protester, prime reason for target being selected is the media worthiness. Okay? They want that message out there. They want the publicity for their cause. That's their exploitation, which again we'll come on to. The way to look at it is, and I'll use UK examples, if there was a protest at the Tate or the British Library, the media profile and the target selection of that is going to be preferred to a rural museum, let's just say Bowes in Barnard Castle, which is out in the countryside and quite difficult to get to, not surrounded by cities, many people whatsoever. So the media, the targeting, they would rather target Tate because the profile of the venue, objects inside, than, as I say, Bowes, which might be, is as equally a beautiful museum, but the profile of the museum itself and its contents might not reach the wider audience. Now, it's interesting that Just Stop Oil, on their target selection process, they actually came out with a comment, and they said that they'd actually consulted with art restoration experts to find a way to glue themselves to the paintings without damaging it. How true that is, I don't know, but that's what has been said. Some of the other comments that they came out with, and again, these are interesting comments because it can help you understand their reason for selecting targets. And that's fires, food crisis and drought make it increasingly difficult. We decide to use art to sound an alarm call, not alarm clock, alarm call. We are heading towards social and eco-climate collapse. These are their words. In the same way that we defend our artistic heritage, we should be dedicated to the care and protection of the planet that we share with the rest of the world. Okay. So actually they've acknowledged that they are targeting, or that art, there is a direct association with art and what their overriding names are. So if a target has been selected, what do we think about in the planning stage? To be truthful, planning stage is so wide and varied, but it includes access. How easy is access into a venue? Are there any barriers? Are there any security measures? What equipment are they going to need to carry out this attack? And let's be very simplistic about it. Glue, soup, cake, paint, stencils. All of these are equipment that's being used in these type of attacks. What media coverage are they going to have? From the video that you would have seen, there was a lot of media who were there at the time of the attacks. Now, do we think that that's just purely by coincidence, or do we think that the Guardian's environmental reporter was there at a pre-planned time for a pre-planned purpose? I'm not being cynical, but as part of their planning, they might want to maximise the media coverage. And so that could be people from within the organisation, filming, preparing, etc., etc. So all of that has to be planned. They may very well look at what security procedures exist. Now, this is something where culturally there's a wide difference around the world. In the Middle East, it could be that you have airport-style security measures where you're searching for objects. What objects are you searching for? It doesn't matter, but you have a set procedure to go through. In other countries, such as the UK, you actually may not have any formal search procedures whatsoever, because the nature and culture of the museum is one that you want to educate, welcome, and create that environment that people want to come in and appreciate the art. And so therefore the physical security barriers might be lower. Security personnel, are there security personnel deployed? Again, some countries, it's a requirement that there are security personnel. In other countries, they're not security personnel, but they're warders or invigilators or front of house staff who've been trained. All of these things come into the planning, as does timings, as does transportation, how they're going to get to the venue. And just if we look at them videos that were shown, one person was there with a folding chair. Far be it for me to say, is that really an object that you would want to go into a museum? But they went in with the folding chair. Glue. You saw that one of the people had the glue was hidden down inside of a bra, because are they going to be searched? Certainly not like that, not by anybody, not by a general security person. Having the media there in place, going in with cake. So all of these things can feature during that planning phase. You know, it's not just like that mug where the lady might have decided to throw it. A lot of effort goes into the success of the protest, of the attack taking place. Failure to plan is planning to fail, is the old adage. And to be truthful, the more planning that they do, the more likely it is of their success. The attack or protest action, whichever terminology you want to use, it's normally fast, and the reason it's fast is they don't want to be prevented. They don't want that interdiction to prevent them from achieving their aim, which is maximise publicity, make statements, get that media out on the internet, on social media, on mainstream media. Their intention to cause damage, there isn't any clear evidence that their intention is to cause damage to artwork. They do cause damage to third, to where they're painted. They can cause damage for restoration. They're increasing the risk of damage when soup and other food has to be cleaned from beautiful pieces of art. Escape, we've mentioned that, and as we say, hand glued on the wall, they're not going to go away very fast. Exploitation, getting the message out there, that's their exploitation, and it's global. They are marketing their causes. They're seeking donations. You know, there is reportedly $1 million was paid into this or other organisations to help them continue their efforts. Gaining new followers. This sort of publicity, it's there, it's attracting attention. And ultimately their exploitation and their aim is getting the UK government, although I'm sure within a few weeks, months, that's going to be a lot broader, because it isn't just Stop Oil in the UK, getting them to reverse their policies. Phoebe Plummer said, we're using the actions to get media attention. So she actually said it while hand was glued, because we need to get people to talk about this now. And we know that civil resistance works. History has shown that it works. The problem with this sort of attack is that they're craving that media. They're craving that exploitation. What if and what happens when the shock dissipates? People shrug their shoulders. Now, I know there are some who can't wait for that to happen, because media is part of the problem, and I agree with them. Media is part of the problem. But what happens then? Because if they need to retain that shock value, is the attack or the potential for damage going to increase? If by reaching new followers who might not have the intellect or the intent and might be more radical than just Stop Oil, that they see it as, well, let's cause the damage. So this process runs with it lots of risks now, but also into the future. And the future, the concern certainly that I have, is that future escalation that happens. But just talking about the attack cycle, let's give you a quick example. And this is obviously our caking incident that happened earlier this year. So the target selection, why was it selected? One of the highest profile patents in the world, if not the highest. When we look at the planning, he went as an old woman, disguised. Used a wheelchair. Using a wheelchair, you're able to get past many of the security checks and you're able to conceal different things. He brought his cake and he was then able to stand up and smear. Obviously, if we take this attack from a media perspective and from a protest perspective, you know, and say he caked the protective glazing. Now you could say, didn't work. Yes, it did. It did work. Escape wasn't really an issue. The arrest is part of the exploitation. And the exploitation was global media coverage of the attack. And his words were aimed at saving the planet. So before I go on, that's outlined, and I know I've been talking a lot because my throat's dry. That's outlined historical protests that have taken place. The more modern protests that have taken place, or given examples of them, and how a protest can take place. One of the things on the first slide that it showed on the attack cycle is the use of surveillance. Now, I haven't got the data to say whether surveillance has been used. I very much doubt that it isn't the case. And surveillance is used once a target is selected through to the attack. And what we'll do is we'll talk a bit later on about surveillance. But what I will say, surveillance is used by terrorists, surveillance is used by criminals, surveillance is used by protesters. And it's a pre-attack. If you can identify pre-attack surveillance, there is a greater opportunity to take proactive actions. Okay. So, what sort of actions can be taken? I've used the word considerations, and I use this markedly, and the reason is that, and I mentioned it right at the start, different museums adopt different approaches. There are different cultures globally about what we can do, how we can do it. There are different approaches that are taken by senior management teams, by different museum groups, by government legislation. So these are some things, and I'm just going to show, and these are things that I think are worthy of consideration. The important word here is it's proactive. You know, I really can't stress how important it is to be proactive. You know, yes, there is an element of reactiveness, but I would much rather prevent something from taking place in the first place, where the damage isn't caused, the incident isn't happened, reputations aren't risked, than having to deal with the aftermath, which we should still consider, but proactive prevention is better than reactive response. So I want to show a quick video. So there's a video. Now, if we consider what the media, or part of the media, says, there's a lot of comments saying, "Well done. This is brilliant." I have concerns, and to some degree, I don't think that's the best approach that could have been taken. If we think about it, there's the hand glue on the glazing. But a guard comes up, the media is there, the world's media is there, and he rips the hands off. Okay, that's fine. No blood, nothing like that. But then he starts dragging them. Then he starts lifting her, exposing her underwear, her bra, things like that. think about the reputational damage. Is that something that you want to be associated with your museum? Does it come across professionally? Is there the potential for litigation in court? All of these things are there. They are potentials that could happen. I won't say that the actions are wrong or right. That's not in my place to say that. But is it the sort of actions I would want to see in any venue that I'm responsible for helping protect their assets? Probably it's not. There are other ways. So instead of the brawn, that's the muscle I think we should be using. We should be looking and thinking about it rationally. But as part of the thought process, as part of the thinking rationally about what has happened, what we want to happen, what can we do? Now, any program, any protective program, I believe, starts with one thing: risk. We have to understand the risks that this type of protest bring. We have to assess what is necessary, what is acceptable. We have to assess whether or not there is a real risk to damage, a real risk of damage to artwork, or is it a case of we can actually accept certain risks. Risks have to be accessed, and it doesn't matter what organisation, whether it's a cultural venue or anything. If I'm putting together a security program for that company, it always starts with a risk-based approach. So we understand what risks exist and also what risks are accepted. Risks that exist in London, in New York, in Paris might differ from, let's just say, Aberdeen, Amiens, Bruges. Okay. So, but by understanding the risk that exists, it allows then a rational thought process to be taken to implement steps that are acceptable and agreeable. And part of that really is, and I've mentioned there, what is the organisation's risk acceptance tolerance level? What do they think are the most important risks for them to manage? And another thing with regards to risk is, who are the risk owners? My view is that everybody has a part to play in ownership of risk in an organisation. Right? But there has to be somebody who is ultimately accountable. What do they say as an individual or as a group? What I would also say is that we are not at a stage now where we shouldn't be accepting the protesters in a museum, in a gallery, in a cultural venue is a risk that has to be assessed and should form part of the risk management process. We can't stick our head in the sand and say it's not really a risk, it's short term. Doesn't matter how short term a risk is a risk. What is the organisation going to do to actually manage that risk? I say risk management, it should feature within every organisation's governance. And when we talk about governance, what do we mean? We can talk for hours on end about security governance and that, and it will differ. But any security governance, it should be directed. It should come from it should be driven by and directed by the security risks that exist, and it has to be within the organisation's risk acceptance levels. Without understanding the risk, without having the governance, what happens then is reactions become subjective. Now it could be that I would say, oh yes, let's have a policy. Some organisations might not have the capabilities of writing a policy, writing procedures, etc. I'll rephrase that, of writing a policy document, policy statement, and creating it a higher level document. That's fine. It might be best practice because again, that's the coat hanger. That gives you that direction, and it ties into the governance of the organisation. But operationally, irrespective of the size of the organisation, the shape of the organisation, the profile of the organisation, there should be clearly defined procedures that outline what actions are expected to be taken. Now, this might take a thought process, and it might not appear that simple. But then procedures have to tie in with what the senior management, what the risk owners, what the senior management want and expect to be delivered. If there aren't procedures and they haven't been agreed and haven't been signed off, then really, can any member of staff be blamed if they take appropriate action which subsequently the senior management team say, oh, we didn't want that, we wouldn't do that. If you wouldn't want that, don't do that. Put it, document it, and make sure that the procedures exist. By having the procedures, what you're doing then is ensuring that you've got clarity. Everybody can understand what is to be done, how it's to be done, what's expected of them, and what's expected of other colleagues inside there. Now, I'm not saying that a procedure means that everything will go according to plan, and it will be, but it gives you a start, and it reduces the risk of subjectivity creeping in, or dare I say, having a debate about what actions we should or shouldn't take if a protest takes place. What I would always say is that I've seen it where all of a sudden this is seen as a security issue, and so they go to the security director, security manager, and say, write a procedure. So they'll write a procedure and issue it and say, there you go, we've now got a procedure. What I would say is err on the side of caution. Procedures do not just, this for a protest, any procedure that's written will not just impact the security team. It goes much wider than that. When it goes much wider than that, I always recommend pulling together the different teams, whether it be front of house, invigilation, facilities, the curatorial team, working together to devise a procedure, a plan. You know, this is how we're going. This is our action plan for dealing with protesters. This is what we need. This is who's going to do what. But so long as you've got that collaborative approach, nobody can say, I didn't know what to do. And what you do is you actually obtain, it's easier then to obtain collective buy-in. Once it's there, you know, you've got it. But it's no good having governance unless people are aware of what it is, how it's to be implemented, and what's expected of them. You can have thousands of procedures, and I've seen some locations that do have thousands of procedures, and I scratch my head and think, how many of these are going to be implemented? Or do they expect somebody to all of a sudden go to page or subsection 5, page 110 and say, that's the procedure I need to adopt? KISS principle, keep it simple. You know, the easiest way, once a procedure is created, is actually we need to make sure that people understand it. Training and education, to me, isn't always about formal courses. It's the softer side. It's the briefing. It's working with teams, and it doesn't matter who does it. As in, it's not really a security responsibility solely. It could also be the front of house staff. It could also be the operations team. Where here's our procedure. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. What's always best is actually making it, you know, inclusive, where you can bring everybody together. If you feel, based on the risk, that the risks are so great that your place will be targeted, why not introduce a training session? I mean, what we're talking about today, is part of a wider training session. But there's nothing to stop individuals at your venue saying, all right, can we have a couple of hours where we can talk about this? We can talk people through what's expected of them. We can show them. So it can be briefing, it can be shadowing. You can actually go down the lines of tabletop exercises, walkthrough drills, or even a full exercise. You know, all of these options are available there. So while we say training education, what we're really hoping to achieve is increasing knowledge, increasing understanding, and that knowledge and understanding is transferred into actions if it ever happened. And it could be, the part of it is, you know, that's not to say that you will proactively grab hold of somebody. It could be that you stand back, let them get on with it, radio through. It comes down to individual museums, galleries, etc., what their procedure and their processes are. What I would say is that, you know, in the training and education, there's two areas that I'm quite passionate about because of their added value, not only for protests, but also in and I've mentioned it, pre-attack surveillance by organised crime groups, and also, dare I say, terrorism. Situational awareness. You know, situational awareness is a wonderful tool for any museum, any gallery, any cultural venue, irrespective of shape or size. If you increase and ensure that staff are situationally aware, there's a greater likelihood of anything untoward happening being noticed, being seen, identified. And situation aware, here's a really nice description of it, and those of you who've been on our training programs will have seen it countless times before, but I still think it's a wonderful description. Using your sensory stimulus and analytical an analytical process takes place which determines whether the situation that is or has been presented is one of normality or not. Now, just taking that, I know that invigilators, front of house staff who work within gallery spaces know and understand what is normal in there. They might have been there 10, 15, 20 years. They might have been there 2 months. But they will know and understand what is normal. They will know and understand if something has changed. The trick, if you want to call it a trick, the benefit of what we hope to achieve is that people actually register that change and do something about it. I suppose a simple way of saying is, you know, understand and respond to what your senses are telling you. So that's your sense of sight, your hearing, your taste, your touch. All of these things come to play in situational awareness. Let's give some examples. A group of journalists arrive with cameras without any appointment. Is that normal? Or is it potentially a precursor to an incident? It's a glorious sunny day outside. 3 people walk in carrying backpacks, folded chairs, wearing thick padded jackets. Is it normal? And it could be. All of these things could be normal, but your staff are those who would understand what is normality in the venue that you're operating in. You know, it's a group of people are maintaining eye contact, but they never come together. They don't talk to each other, but you can see that they're nodding, they're indicating. Is that normal behaviour? Or is that something that isn't an expected activity of people? Surely if they know each other, you would wave and come together and speak. People appear nervous. They're looking furtively. They're avoiding eye contact. Situational awareness and staff who are able to identify these potential triggers, you know, can do so by situational awareness. As I say, we're not saying these are nailed on, that is suspicious, so we're going to tackle them to the ground and prevent them from doing something. It's assessing and analysing what you're seeing. And it could be that you actually create, as part of the procedure, if something suspicious is seen, you create a process where additional support comes, you know, or you're able to discuss things by use of code words, things like, you know. So there are activities that can be taken, but if you are not aware of your surroundings, and I've got countless photos around the world of people who are supposed to be invigilating sat on the mobile phone, sat watching their Netflix on there, reading a book, or doing anything other than paying attention to what's surrounding, because that's the sort of thing any hostile actor is going to come in and look at. They're going to look at how alert, how aware are individuals, and the more alert and aware you can demonstrate, the more doubt you will put into a third person's mind. I'll talk about surveillance detection purely because, as I said, it features in the attack process from target selection through to the attack itself, and it can take place any time between that, and it can take any time. It could be months in advance. It could be a minute or so before an attack takes place. It can be undertaken in many ways, and this sort of surveillance detection training is beneficial to staff, because if they have the necessary awareness, as I say, we can detect any hostile surveillance, irrespective of whether it's criminal, protest, or terrorist related. And why do people conduct surveillance? They want to obtain detailed information. They want to know how many security people are in an area, or is it better going to another gallery where there's less security, less invigilators? They might want to update previous information, so they might have visited the site. They might go online. Google's a wonderful thing from a security perspective. I hate it when we go through galleries because it's doing the work, it's doing the surveillance work for people. Establish a pattern of life. What time is there a changeover? Is there a time when at lunchtime actually that gallery space is left without any invigilators, any security, or anybody there? Confirm or reconfirm the suitability of the target, and finally to carry out a hostile act, which may very well be super glue on the wall, food, protest, comment, media. So if that's how the attack, or how attacks can take place, etc., what approaches can we take for managing the risks from protesters? One of the things that I said is that there isn't really a wrong or right answer. Lots of this will come down to individual organisations, individual galleries, individual senior management teams, and it'll be risk-based. Okay. It could be that there is pre-knowledge of an attack taking place or of a protest taking place, and it could be facilitated. Now, the facilitation of a protest means that actually there's no damage caused or damage is reduced. So you can actually take steps to minimise the operational impact of it, and it could be that actually you agree with what the protesters are there about, for their reasons, justification. That's an option. There are pros and cons with whichever approach you take. One of the biggest, so the pros is that you minimise the damage caused to yourselves. You can normally minimise the time that the protests take place, and you can be seen as a supportive cultural venue. Downside is that you might be okay, but then are you then just transferring the protest risk onto somebody else because they can't keep going to the place that lets them in? Okay. What if the team is unaware? So there's no advance notice. All of a sudden, the protest there, your situational awareness hasn't worked. You haven't identified any surveillance. Okay, the protest is happening. What do? Now, you could allow the protest to continue, minimise the loss, harm, or damage that's caused. You could then decide, okay, our procedure is that we're going to clear the space of everybody, including the journalists, and just leave them there. And then we're going to call the police. There's pros and cons with that approach. The pros are you've taken positive action, and you're waiting for the arrest to take place. The cons are, yes, they've still been successful in the media, and you could have, during the course of removing people, adverse publicity that's taken while filming you moving. But it's an option. It could be that actually your surveillance, you've identified, your situational awareness is spot on, you've seen something that isn't right, you've seen potential activity taking place, and part of your procedure is that you call for a surge. Okay? And the surge is additional people come to your space, and it's a show of force, not necessarily a physical force in the sense of taking hold and apprehending people, because at that time you probably just have suspicion. But it's a visible show of force, and if something does go to happen, there's a greater likelihood of you being able to interject and prevent, but it will depend on your processes. One of the things I'm asked is arrest or not to arrest. It sounds like Shakespeare. But again, if somebody is arrested, it's part of their publicity. Are you feeding their whole exploitation, their whole reason for carrying out the attack in the first place, and magnifying it, especially if violence is used or there's a heavy-handed approach? Again, these are not decisions that I can make. It's down to individual venues to consider these sort of things. The one that we heard at I think it was the Autostat, where the protesters had got in to the museum and decided to glue themselves, and so the company cleared, turned off the lights, turned off the heat, and left them overnight in the cold. Now, it might have had a positive effect, might have had a negative effect, but again, it's down to individual organisations as to what their approach is going to be, and the only way you can do that is through having and agree and identify at least a start point by a procedure. Two more things. Firstly, do nothing. You've assessed the risk, you've assessed the level of damage, and as an organisation, you're prepared to accept that event takes place and its impacts, and once it's done, we'll clean up and we'll carry on. There is nothing wrong with that approach. It's if that is what the management wants, but it's a proactive action. There's been a decision made, this is the approach that we are going to take, and it means that everybody understands that approach. I don't know about other countries, but in the UK, you can issue a trespass notice if somebody has committed damage, and you can actually work collaboratively with other groups. Why issue a trespass notice? In the UK law, if somebody commits criminal damage, it's questionable as to where it will be dealt with and what the actions will be. If, however, they enter as a trespasser, then the offence is burglary, which then gives the police more powers because they can be jailed for longer. That might actually work as a deterrent effect. Pros and cons. Pros are that might be sufficient to deter people in the first instance, certainly if they've been in the venue previously. The con might be that might increase the targeting because they feel that you're against them. So the approaches to managing the risk from protesters, hopefully what I've been able to outline there isn't a wrong or right answer uniformly. It will depend on where you are in the world, what legislation there is, what your senior management team, what operationally is effective, what you want and how you want to act to manage it. One thing I would say is that we are not going to get rid of this sort of protest in the short term, and this sort of protest is media driven. Social media driven, mainstream media driven. I would love us to be able to do a media blackout. Look, if the protesters in Iran are still getting the message out to the world, protesters where there aren't the restrictions that the government impose, the message is going to get out there. There isn't a wrong or right answer other than understand the approach for the venue, agree it, make sure everyone's aware of it, and then implement it. One thing I would say, and I'm very mindful of this from dealing with following major significant incidents, not just in the cultural setting, but post-terrorist or post serious violence incidents. Once the protest is finished, no organisation should think that's the end of it. Great, we can get on with life as normal. You have to consider much more than that, because we hope that no protest ever comes to your venue. But what you have to realise is that if you are unlucky enough to face a protest, it could be that that protest is the worst act of violence that visitors to your venue, staff, or other people who are at your venue will ever witness in their life. And if that's the most violent, they could be traumatised by what's been observed and what's been what's happened in their presence. And I do know this, speaking from people who have been involved in these sort of events, that they did find it traumatic. But organisations must remember that there is the potential for trauma. So what should they consider? Firstly, ensure that steps are taken to minimise future harm or injury. Now, is that just for staff, or should that actually be extended to visitors who may have been there and witnessed it? Again, it's not an answer I can give, but I do know certain venues where any visitor who's been involved in a traumatic event, they will be offered counselling exactly the same as the members of staff, because they feel it's their duty of care. The senior management team thought it was their duty of care to adopt this approach. Ensure the well-being of people immediately after. Okay, do people need refreshments? Are they in a safe location? Are they able to calm down? Discuss and document. From an operational perspective, it is appropriate to discuss and ask how people feel. It is appropriate for people to say that worked, that didn't work, because it's only by discussing and documenting what didn't work, what people felt didn't feel, can people actually take proactive steps then to manage it and make it, improve it should it happen in the future. That's where the strategization comes in, and the welfare considerations. Welfare considerations, especially those staff who are directly involved. This might feel traumatic for them for weeks, months, even years. It's making sure there's that sort of support and that you're monitoring people's welfare, so you're getting the best out of them and you're giving them back just in that way of comfort, support and general well-being. So if I bring things to a conclusion before we open up for questions, my thoughts are that firstly, by their nature, museums and galleries that are open to the public are going to be targeted by protesters. Just equally, they're going to be targeted by criminals, because we're opening our doors to cultural venues, allowing access, and we want it to be a welcoming space that people enjoy and appreciate. Target hardening can work, but is that culturally acceptable? There are times when search procedures, bag searches take place, but okay, I have a banner, I have my tin of soup stuffed down my pants. My wife has the glue and the spray paint down her bra. You're not going to search to that extent. Are you then going to implement X-ray style scanners? Yeah, well, if you've got that much money, that's a cost-benefit analysis to be taken. Is it what the museum and the nature and culture of the museum or gallery want? I can't answer that, but you can always target harden. Attacks will continue. My concern, as I alluded to, is that the damage may worsen. It may worsen because they've got added people or people who have joined the organisation who don't necessarily understand the reason for protecting artwork, and that's why hands are glued on the wall. It may not understand that actually they proactively look for glazed artwork because they know that the damage caused to glazing is minimal in comparison with thrown soup, and it hits the actual paintwork or glue in your hand. So my concern is that damage may worsen, especially if the effects are starting to subside in the general public or in the general media world. They just shrug the shoulders and say it's another attack. Okay. What I would hope is that eventually the protesters will actually start alienating, and there's clear evidence of this, some of their support base, because people like me will question why. Yes, you've given us these words, but why attack our artwork? Something that's survived 300 or 400 years, but you're happy to cause damage or risk damage in that. Go for the oil refinery, go for the roads, do all of that, but please leave our cultural heritage alone. We do face challenges. Now, I couldn't find, there was apparently over the last week, there's been some specific quotes from Greta regarding damage to artwork. One that I did find is that she said, with regards to the attacks in museums and galleries, a lot of people who become desperate, and it is therefore responsible to expect them to try new types of actions. And I think this specifically related to attacks in the museums and cultural space. It isn't helpful because she has a worldwide following of hundreds of thousands of people, many of them young, who actually might interpret this as, okay, there's a green light for us to go out and attack. What I would say is that there's only so much that museums, galleries can do unless they want to close up. And nobody wants that because the protesters have won, but they won't have achieved any of their aims. We need to work together. And what I would say is for any organisation, sounds really stupid, really simple, but make sure that the organisation understands the risk it faces. Make sure that it has the governance in place to manage, handle and deal with any incident or any event that takes place. And make sure that your staff are aware of what they need to do, how they need to do it and why they're doing it. Eventually, I do believe that the public will turn against the protesters. It may be that they'll then move on to other venues. We have seen them attack car showrooms. We have seen them attack Harrods. But there's only one Harrods and only one Aston Martin showroom, whereas there are hundreds of museums. Hopefully, bringing all of that together, it helps people understand a bit more about the different attacks that take place, have taken place historically, put it into a more current context, how attacks take place, and some sensible steps, pragmatic steps that I think organisations can take to manage and reduce it. On that, I thank you, and I don't know whether there are any questions. I certainly don't believe a custodial sentence is being handed out. I think if we take the guy in France, he was arrested but then sent to a mental institution. I believe that the cases are ongoing, and I'm sure there's others on the call who will be able to clarify. Cases are ongoing with regards to Holland, some in London, and I believe where there have been people charged it has been non-custodial. Thanks for that. It's a very important question. Those of you who know me, my background is from diplomatic security, and I was very mindful that you can have one person looking at 10 video cameras, but it's still only one person. Whereas actually, if you have everybody aware of what they're looking for, and you can then engage 100 people, so you have 100 sets of eyes instead of one set of eyes looking at 10 cameras. I've adopted exactly the same approach with museums and cultural venues. We've probably trained well over 1,000 people now around the world, and it is that security is everybody's responsibility. That's what we try to drive home. But when we say responsibility, that doesn't mean to say that we're making everybody security officers. What it does mean is we increase the levels of awareness and vigilance of everybody, and in doing so, there's a greater likelihood that something suspicious will be seen and triggered. And again, that's irrespective of whether that's for protesters or whether that's for terrorists or organised criminals. It's a very valid point, and the more that senior management, front of house staff can actually encourage that, the better it is for the overall protection of the venue. The buzzwords that are used at the minute, and it doesn't matter whether it's in a cultural setting or whether it's I'm working with some venues now, and sporting venues, and they said, "Oh, can we have behavioural detection?" The reality is that behavioural detection, all you're doing is you are looking. It's situation awareness. You are looking at the environment. You're looking at the individual. You're looking at their activities, and is that one of normality? And it's you are looking at their behaviour as well. So it really, irrespective of how you approach it, it is an appropriate level and it's appropriate activity to introduce for anybody really. Frontline, I've even said it where if somebody is working in the gardens, I want them to be my outer eyes and ears. Just purely so that they can actually, forewarned is forearmed, and they're probably the first people who would see any suspicious activity before people even get into the museum itself. You hit a very important point there, and that's about management. It's okay having the procedures and having this, having that, but actually it's that engagement with the staff, letting them understand what the expectations are, being there. And you're right, they're not police officers. They're not. It might be cases where there are security guards and that is an expectation. That's what they're paid for. But generally speaking, your front of office or front of house staff are there to help support and help people appreciate the art that's existing there. And the emphasis on personal safety, irrespective of whether it's a protest, criminal, whatever, you just stand back. Personal safety has to come into play. As has been seen, and as Just Stop Oil keep pronouncing, there's it can always be repaired, it can always be fixed, but you can't do that to human life. And so it's a very important point. So thank you for sharing that. What I would like to say is thank you very much. I said the reason for holding this is hopefully to help support and help people better understand, and especially those smaller museums and venues that don't have the resources that other larger ones have. If anybody has any questions or points or is concerned about anything, please feel free to drop myself or Louise an email. We do this professionally, but I think this is one of those areas where yes, we've got this as a professional programme, but morally for me, this is the right thing to do, hopefully helping the community. So if there's no other questions, thank you all, and have a great weekend.